Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, I stand before you today wearing the hat of the chairman of AW90, which is the British Standards Committee for Quality Systems in the Food Industry. Although at our last meeting, because the breadth of what we're doing and being involved with is changing, we have changed the title to Food Safety and Integrity Committee. So makes it more relevant because food safety and food standards aren't just quality related these days. So yeah, the purpose of this brief talk, and it will only be brief, I could talk for a lot longer than 20 minutes, as many people would know of me. I'll keep it short. It is really just to give you an introduction to what standards are about, and then move broadly into the ISO 22000 Food Safety Management System arena, and just cover that. And in between, to sandwich in between that, the high-level structure, which those of you that are how many here are involved with ISO 9001 at the moment? Not too many. You'll be familiar with the changes that are coming with that. Yeah, very briefly then, the food and drink industry, as many of you will appreciate, is one of the UK's largest industries. 95 billion pound turnover, 400,000 staff, and covers a vast range of activities and the full food chain, of course. Management of food safety has been involved with a number of different schemes, but most significantly as an international independent scheme is ISO 22000. And of course, they're all tied up as well with HACCP. The food standards, just talking about standards, what standards do is they make what good really looks like. And that comes from the fact that there's a lot of people get involved in making the standards. It's consensus-based, and it involves lots of thought leaders. So the people on the committee I'm involved with are members of industry and a broad range of people to ensure that we can really get down to the nitty-gritty of what standards should be about. And they are voluntary. And indeed, I stand before you today as a volunteer. I don't get paid by BSI to be a committee chairman. I just do it for the love of it. Standards, they're not regulations, so they're not mandated by the government or the EU to make them, but they are used by regulators. They incorporate, but sometimes the regulations do incorporate particular standards, and that was particularly so with child safety, where you've got international or European standards that are involved, harmonised standards, and I'll briefly mention those as well. The standards are written by public, by stakeholders, as I've already explained. We can see there that the benefits of standards, economic benefits. Standards play a vital and often invisible role in supporting economic growth. They contribute to 8.2 billion's worth of the British economy, say British economy. They contribute to productivity, and really they underpin an awful lot of what we do. If you really get down into the detail, you'll soon find what the benefits of being involved with standards. If we now move on, maybe I can do this myself now. Whoop, I'm driving. I've taken control. the hierarchy of standards. People probably don't appreciate what the different hierarchies are, but we'll see at the bottom you've got the professional codes and corporate and technical specifications. These private standards, like BRC standards, codes of practice, etc., they're developed by industry. And whilst they meet technical requirements, etc., for specific industries, sometimes the involvement in their development can be quite narrow. As we move on to the next level, sponsored standards, how many people here have actually heard of publicly available specifications, PASs? 1, 2, very few people. Right, just a brief word about a publicly available spec. And you'll see a mention of one a little later on, PAS 96. These are standards that industry sectors or trade organisations really feel are necessary, and government bodies, because they will sponsor them. They are actually sponsored. They will pay for the development of those standards, but they do become public. They're basically a technical group will develop the standard. They will then, from developing that standard, it will go out for public consultation as one quick iteration. Then it will come back, then it will get published. And it will also probably be branded as well with the sponsors for that particular standard. That standard then can survive for 3 years, have another iteration for another 3 years, but then generally they're expected to move on to be British standards, or as you'll see with one of them I'll mention in a minute, they will become international standards. British standards then are the national standards that we have, which you'll all be familiar with. Then we go to the regional ones, ENs, European Harmonised Standards, which I'm sure a number of you will probably be familiar with. And that then leads into the international standards. And that can work both ways. You can find that British standards will actually produce a set of standards or a standard that ISO will adopt. On the other hand, it will go the other way around, that the international standards can have a recommendation for a standard, they develop it, as indeed ISO 22000 is, and that comes the other way down and gets then adopted as a national standard. I briefly mentioned the sandwich. That is the Annex SL. The few of you that are involved with ISO 9001 will know that it's just been reissued in 2015 as a new or a revised standard. That standard is one of the first, amongst the first, that has a specific structure, which I'll briefly mention in a few minutes. And the purpose of that ISO decided that because there are a range of management standards, so you've got 9,000 for quality, 14,000 environment, 18,000 for health and safety, etc., that there should be a common structure. And the benefit of that is that anybody that's implementing a new standard or management standard, if you've got variations in the structure, it becomes more difficult to actually implement it because you've got a range of different interpretations. The high-level structure now makes sure that all the standards that we develop, and the food safety one, ISO 22000, is no different, and I'll explain in a minute, so that you've got a similar structure to them. Come back. It's got a mind of its own at the moment. Go away, come back. Right, stay. Thank you. I have a man that will sort it. Or it could be a lady. Anyway, basically, let me just explain whilst the technology is sorting itself out. Yeah, hopefully we're back now. You'll see there that this is the standard structure, the high-level structure now for all management standards that are developed. So normative references, terms and definitions, the context of the organisation, that's introducing risk. So there's a risk element to it, who your interested parties are, your stakeholders, leadership, not management, leadership, planning for your operations, what support you've got in terms of knowledge, expertise, etc. Operation, that's the bit that's basically producing the product or the service. And then performance evaluation, the monitoring, and improvement, because it goes through the circle. Just to give you a feel for what the food safety or the food standards landscape looks like, Codex HACCP, or food safety, obviously involved with that. Anybody that didn't know, they're actually currently, Codex is actually reviewing and revising the original HACCP, so there's some thoughts coming out on that. Then you've got the 22,000 publicly available specs, extensions of that to FSSC on the left-hand side, the private standards, the BRCs, etc. Innovation, fraud, we know all the issues that are going on with fraud, making sure there's traceability, and the technical standards as well that are underpinning and supporting those standards. All basically involved with the farm to fork, the full chain. Just looking briefly at some of those supporting standards as we move into ISO 22000, you can see that publicly available specifications that we talked about earlier, they're underpinning some of the ISO 22000. They started with PAS 220, which has now been adopted as an international standard. That was BSI in association with the manufacturers, putting in place prerequisite programs to support those activities. One of the weaknesses that was with ISO 22000 was the fact that as a general standard, it didn't specifically define prerequisite programs enough. There's some of the technical standards that we were referred to earlier. So those programs are looking at food manufacturing. There's elements for catering, particularly for farming, food packaging, and the Dutch standards making body are currently producing a technical spec to do with storage and transportation to go with 22,000. I talked also about publicly available specification, and there's an example there, PAS 96, which is a standard was supported by DEFRA and the Food Standards Agency to enable organisations that use it and using the TACCP, Threat Assessment Critical Control Points, really to look at how you manage those threats, because of course in this day and age there's always those opportunities for organisations to try and attack your food products really for negative purposes, to put it simply. Just briefly, looking at the food safety management system principles, and this is based on the existing ISO 22000-2005, you'll see it's got the classic plan, do, check, act approach in the old version. And you go through the planning, realisation, hazard analysis, HACCP, etc., implementation, monitoring, verification and improvement. Also, I would identify for you that ISO 22000 applies across the full food chain. And principally, a lot of those activities are currently been in manufacturing, but it also applies to equipment manufacturers, catering, etc. the service providers, full food chain involvement with the standard. One of the one of the interesting things now is that ISO 22000, which was initiated and started in 2005, has been around now for a good 10 years. And although it had an opportunity for a revision some 5 years ago, the decision was made, because it was so new, not to do so. But now, ISO 22000 is up for revision, and indeed, that process has already started. And it started nearly, well over 12 months ago now. We had a working group, international working group, with representation from 50, 60 countries. A committee draft 1 was produced. That generated 191 pages of comments, which the committee then sat down for 4 meetings and came up with committee draft 2, which, surprise, surprise, committee draft 2 has now generated 161 pages of comments. And a couple of weeks' time over in New York, the working group will be sitting down again to digest those, with the aim of coming out with a draft for public consultation in February, March next year. But one of the things you'll see, talking about the high-level structure, is that you've got basically 2 Plan, Do, Check, Act systems. Operation and Planning Control, Section 8 of the high-level structure, looks at basically food safety and the product safety and how you develop that. Sitting along at the top of that is the other Plan, Do, Check, Act, which is actually how you manage food safety. And there will also, because we talked about this being risk related, in the top half, they'll be looking at business risks, etc., as well. So, lot happening in that at the moment. And that brings me very neatly to the current revision schedule as to where we actually are. You can see at the top right-hand, WG6, December, that is where we're at the moment, the 6th working group meeting in New York. Hopefully, fingers crossed, out of that meeting will then come the DIS, draft international standard, and that will be circulated for 12 weeks. Now, at that point is your opportunity to have a look at it. It'll be available. It's also available on the BSI Drafts website, which you can access, you can look at the drafts, and you can make comments. And really, that's one of the messages I'd like to get across, is that this is your opportunity to contribute to this international standard. It will then move on. There'll be another meetings 7 and 8 in October, November next year, with the hope, all things being equal, that by August 2018, we will have a revision of the 22,000. Very, very quick, brief run through. We could have expanded on this and spent all afternoon. I shall be repeating this a little later on, this talk, and I'll see if I can make it a little different for anybody that wants to come and revise it again. So, that's it. Whoop, I've gone altogether. Thank you very much for listening. I hope it's been of interest to you. I am around if anybody wants to talk to me, and if you are interested in becoming involved in the standards making process, I have some little booklets here which explains what it's all about, and if you're interested in being involved in the AW90, have a chat with me. More than pleased to try and get more people on board. Thank you very much for listening. It's much appreciated.